Rachel Carson, a female founder of the environmental movement, wrote her novel Silent Spring in the hopes of spreading awareness of the harsh effects of pesticides like DDT. Before the publication of her book, in 1962, DDT was airily sprayed in neighborhoods and farms around the United States. When discussing a person who left such a legacy behind, like Carson did, you have to ask, was all their work effective? With Carson, the answer is yes. In the early 1960s, the pesticide industry was taking control of the United States. The initial design of pesticides was to stop insect-borne diseases as well as protect crops from infestation. Those are great reasons to use pesticides, right? So what's the issue? In a letter to Carson, a woman named Olga Owens Huckins wrote about the effect DDT was having on the birds around her home. Within this letter was the first time Rachel had encountered the problems involved with the excessive use of pesticides, such as DDT. After receiving this letter, Rachel began exploring deeper into the harsh effects of pesticides. During this time, Carson discovered that DDT can weaken the shells of bird eggs, making it harder for them to reproduce. In a CBS News report soon after the publication of her book, John L. Buckley, a director of a research center, gave a report on the effect DDT had on birds. Carson was bombarded by support, including being mentioned in a press conference by President John F. Kennedy, as well as having hundreds of newspaper articles written about her. Even though there was a lot of support for Carson, it was still hard for chemical and pesticide companies to accept the overwhelming amount of awareness Carson spread through the country. In one newspaper article, it says that Carson's book was the greatest uproar in the pesticide industry since the cranberry scare of 1959. A large controversy swept over the nation. There was constant talk of environmentalism and the ways our country needed to change. In an attempt to dissuade citizens from Carson's claims, pesticide companies made brochures claiming their product was safe. To further prove their point, they would conduct tests where humans would ingest the pesticides, making them seem harmless. Even though the chemical agencies were determined to disprove Carson's claims, soon after the publication of her book, President John F. Kennedy's Presidential Science Advisory Council reviewed and approved all of Carson's claims. Now, the chemical industry was scientifically proven to be wrong about their safety standards. Now at this point, some of you might be thinking, great, but how does this affect me? This is where the action really started taking place. A year after Carson published her book, Silent Spring, she died of breast cancer. While she was alive, she only saw the beginning of what was to come of her book. Within the year, there were headlines about the president making huge changes to the environmental aspects of the government. President Johnson created federal controls over poisonous pesticides that were widely used on farms and in homes. Before this change, the government wasn't able to prevent the sale of pesticides, whether or not their safety was established. This surplus of change created a huge environmental movement that spanned over the entire decade of the 60s and beyond. Have you ever heard of Earth Day? Yes? Well, thank Rachel Carson. Without her push for environmental change, the creation of Earth Day in 1970 might have never happened. On the more governmental side of things, a bill was soon passed known as the National Environmental Policy Act. Senators nowadays say that this act was the most important piece of environmental legislation in our history. This act called for the encouragement of harmony between man and his environment, and this included promoting efforts to eliminate damage as well as to enrich the understanding of ecological systems. Another aspect of our world today that was provoked by Silent Spring was the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. Created under President Nixon in 1970, the EPA's job is to establish pesticide tolerances as well as conduct environmental research. Before Carson's book, these jobs were supposedly handled by the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. One of the first acts of this new government program was to ban the use of DDT. In 1972, the EPA announced the ban, a huge accomplishment for the after effects of Silent Spring. Another huge effect of Carson's book was the surge of interest in conservationism and creating wildlife refuges. With Carson exchanging her ideas through her book with the citizens of the United States, many of them were beginning to realize that our needless and destructive acts enter into the vast cycles of the earth and in time return to bring hazard to us. Exactly like Carson had said. So yes, ultimately all of Carson's research and writings like Silent Spring were effective. In fact, her acts still impact every single one of us to this day. Without Carson, the world would be a drastically different place. And who knows, maybe our springs would be silent.